Right, good evening everybody. Welcome to the first in our series of Difficult Conversations events. We're going to hold a number of these throughout the course of the year. It's our way of looking at an exciting and interactive way of discussing some of the more difficult topics that might not otherwise come to the fore. My name is Gary Dixon. I'm the Chair of Council here at the University of Leicester, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. I'm particularly pleased to be here at Brookfield because I haven't seen this place for 3 years, and this is the after, and I only saw the before. It's particularly good that it is here because actually Brookfield was the site of the University of Leicester's founder. Thomas Fielding Johnson actually used to live here in the old bit, and it feels to me like it's full circle, so it's absolutely wonderful to be here. This series of discussions for our centenary event is part of our commitments to being citizens of change, and it's for us as an institution to share the expertise and the knowledge that a lot of our staff have got. It's part of a public programme that will last a whole year. There'll be lots of things on, so I'd encourage you to pay attention to what's on the website for the centenary events, and to please to spread the word and to come along to as many as you can. As a university, we were founded on philanthropy. At the end of the First World War, the citizens of Leicester got together and raised money to create what was a college and then became a university. So there is no more fitting way than celebrating our centenary than to reflect on that philanthropy and to try and spread our message. There's going to be a number of different speeches that you will hear throughout the course of the year by the way of difficult conversations. There are lots of things happening that we want to talk about. We're not going to shy away from controversial topics. We have lots of issues of free speech in the UK, more widely in the world. We have it in higher education, and we want to make sure that we actually deal with those issues and give people a voice. Tonight's subject is tackling hate, striving for social justice. We're going to be talking about hate crimes and who they affect, what are their impacts, and in a world of escalating tensions and hostility, how do we stop them from happening? To discuss these topics, we've got a distinguished expert panel from across the university and from wider afield. We very much also want you to be part of the conversation. This is being streamed live online. There's the ability to raise questions here in person or online. So there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers after we've had the actual talks. So I'd like to welcome our speakers now. It should be fairly obvious who people are, certainly for the first one, but if you could just raise your hand so people can see who you are. But Simon, you're fairly obviously the Chief Constable of Leicestershire. Simon has been the Chief Constable here in Leicestershire for 11 years now. He's a visiting fellow of our School of Criminology and a very close friend of the university, and I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight, Simon. We also have Isla Dixon, Leicestershire Police's hate crime officer. Isla was born and educated in Zimbabwe, but came over here at the age of 20 and has always worked in encouraging diversity and equality, and you joined the force, I believe, in 2014, working in a number of roles before becoming recently appointed the hate crime officer in 2019. Since then, in addition to her success in working with local communities, Isla has also helped to relaunch and raise awareness of the Stampede Out campaign to encourage people to say no to hate. We have Dr. Amy Clark, who is a teaching fellow in the criminology department. Really pleased to say that Amy has been with the university since 2010 because she was an undergraduate here, stopped on, did her PhD, and is now a postdoctoral researcher. Amy's doctoral research focused on forms of hidden racism, discrimination, and targeted hostility experienced by new migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees in Leicester. It examined hate crime victimisation and the impacts of targeted hostility, and demonstrated how this hostile environment creates significant barriers to the integration of new arrivals into wider British society. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. David Wilkin. David is an honorary fellow of our School of Criminology, where I believe you also did your Masters and your PhD. His PhD focused on hate crimes on disabled people occurring in the UK on public transport. David's passion is to make life better for people who have suffered as victims of hate crimes, specialising in people who have been victimised because of their disability. He's the lead coordinator of the Disability Hate Crime Network and the Hate Crime Ambassador for Disability Rights UK. We have Professor Neil Chakraborty. Neil will be known to most of you as a director of the Centre for Hate Studies and a professor of criminology here at the university. Neil's researched extensively on the subject of hate crime, targeted hostility and violence against minorities. His books are now numbered at 7 on the subject and more than 50 peer-reviewed publications. The Centre for Hate Studies is a world-leading research centre whose core mission is to transform responses to hate and extremism through its research and evidence-based training programmes. And last, but certainly not least, is Professor Tury King. With Tury, you get 2 professors for the price of 1. Tury is a professor in genetics and archaeology, as well as being our professor of public engagement. Most of you will recognise the world-leading work that Tury did on proving the genealogy of King Richard III from that famous car park. And you may also recognise her from her recent programme on BBC Two with Stacey Dooley, which is the DNA Family Secrets. Thank you, Tury, for agreeing to facilitate this. So I'll now hand over to you.
Thank you. So again, welcome everybody to this event. This evening's discussion, as you've heard, is around hate crime, and this is a hugely topical issue. So we know from the recent reports that the number of hate crimes that have been recorded by police in England and Wales has hit its highest ever total this year. And it's something which has been growing year on year. And our researchers here at Leicester have shown that this is only the tip of the iceberg. So you know who everybody is, but I thought it'd be really nice if everyone kind of introduced themselves, said a little bit about what they're working on now, and then we'll start the conversation. So Neil.
Thank you, Tury. Thank you, everyone, for coming along and giving up your evenings for us this evening. We really appreciate it. I am Neil Chakraborty, as you've heard. I'm a professor in criminology and director of the Centre for Hate Studies. I've been researching issues of hate crime for more than 20 years now, and I guess my mission has always involved working very closely with victims themselves, but also with professionals, with practitioners, with communities to try and tackle different forms of hate crime in its various guises. So that's me. Thank you.
Isla.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much to the university for inviting me to come along and join the Chief, who obviously is our main spokesperson when it comes to issues that the force deal with. But my role as hate crime officer is actually to support the Chief Constable and the officers and staff in Leicestershire Police to help and support victims of hate. But the other side is about me going out into the community and actually getting to hear firsthand from victims what it is that they're suffering from and what we can do to help and support them. My introduction told you I come from a diversity and inclusion background, so I'm really, really passionate. And from the other side to what Neil does, I kind of, not academically, but I'm really passionate about supporting people who are victimised by discrimination and prejudice. So really pleased to be here and taking part tonight, so thank you.
David.
Good evening, everyone. I came to the academic life quite late. It's probably apparent to you that I'm not the youngest person on the panel. I spent many years in the public transport industry, and then I was fortunate enough to be the public transport security director for the 2012 London Olympics, which was reasonably successful. And since then, I've had the privilege of working with some lovely people at the University of Leicester, and I'm not saying that because I'm being paid. In the very topic of hate crime research, which is an under-researched area, an under-spoken about area, which makes a difficult discussion like this all the more valuable and credible. And I also teach elsewhere, which I'm not allowed to mention. But I'm looking forward to answering any questions and being as helpful as possible this evening.
Simon.
Yeah, I'm Simon Cole. I'm currently working on being the least qualified person on a panel.
Congratulations.
Talking about hate crime. Obviously, ultimately, the force is responsible for investigating hate crimes as they're reported to us and making sure that we are accessible, particularly to victims, and we deal with offenders as well. Policing, as some of you might have heard me speak before, policing has a kind of social glue role that we perform where we deal with lots of stuff that isn't around crime, but is about how the world rubs along with itself. And so, for me, this is part of that community cohesion work. And, hate crime is where the law has been broken and those aggravating factors are present. So, ultimately, I'm the person accountable for how just over 2,000 police officers and about 1,000 staff deal with hate crimes as they're reported to Leicestershire Police by the 1.1 million people who live across Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland.
Amy.
Hi everyone, I'm Amy Clark. So many years ago, I started volunteering at Victim Support, where I supported victims of hate crime and also survivors of sexual violence. And that was kind of my introduction to victims and the world of victims. And quite early on in my studies, I kind of got drawn to this field of hate crime as part of the work that Neil does, as well as colleagues of ours who have been working in the school. As Gary pointed out, obviously I went on to do my master's and PhD in the school as well, also in the field of hate crime. And I now work for our Centre of Hate Studies, in which we work with all forms of victims of hate crime, as well as practitioners, in order to kind of build a better environment for where we're all able to support victims and their various needs.
So let's get this conversation started. And I have to say, this was really interesting chatting to you all, because I realize that actually there can be a lot of kind of confusion and misinformation, misunderstanding about a really fundamental question, and that is, what is hate crime? What is a hate crime? Neil?
It is a great question because it's not quite as straightforward as one might think. Essentially, Tury, we're talking about acts of hostility motivated by prejudice towards an aspect of your identity. It might be your skin colour, your religious beliefs, your disability, your sexual orientation, your gender identity, or any factor which marks you out as different in the eyes of a perpetrator. So it's quite a long-winded explanation, but in reality, I think most of the people within this room will be very familiar with different forms of hate crime, either because you've encountered it yourself or you know somebody who has. So we're talking about racist graffiti, wheelchair tipping, anti-Semitic slurs, attacks on mosques, homophobic violence, online harassment. These are all examples of hate crime which we see time and time again. Fortunately, the police have a really inclusive and victim-friendly definition of hate crime that I think helps to make sense of the problem and makes it a little bit more digestible for the general public. I'll allow Isla and Simon to talk a bit more about that.
So how do you view it? How do you define it?
Well, the words are very similar to the words that Neil's just used. I mean, for us, if somebody involved or somebody who has seen believes that hostility and prejudice has motivated a crime to happen, then it's in. It's in. That's the definition. So it is a very inclusive way of doing it. And if somebody who witnessed something says, "I think this happened because," then we would record it as hate motivated. But of course, the thing that sometimes what's a hate incident, what's a hate crime? For it to be a hate crime, there's got to be a criminal offence committed, and Neil's just highlighted, graffiti would be criminal damage, so there is a crime. Therefore, but there does need to be a crime, as the start point of this.
So, Amy, where do the misunderstandings start? I know when I was chatting to you before this, there was, people don't necessarily understand what's a hate crime. So, where does the misunderstanding come in?
I think there are probably two things to say on that point. The first is that in our work with victims, when we go and speak to people and say, what are your experiences of hate crime, although more people are becoming more familiar with that term, generally they still think it has to be a really serious offence in order to constitute a hate crime. And actually what we do is kind of break that down a bit and say, okay, well, what are the everyday experiences that people don't typically think of as hate crime, because that's not what they hear in the media, or that's not what they tend to think of first and foremost. So it's about understanding that these also come in the form of everyday incidents of targeted hostility, and they're not just serious violent assaults against people. The other point to make on where the misinformation comes from, I think, is a bit of a backlash that we've kind of experienced in the hate crime world in recent years, where people don't necessarily think it exists in the first place. So there's been quite sensationalized headlines around the hate crime hoax, and that it's a kind of political tool to be divisive and create kind of those divisions in society. And so I think people, because of that, are just really unclear as to what a hate crime is. And I think it's important that, you say that actually we have to establish a crime has been committed first and then look at the motivation. But I don't think that necessarily, depending on what you read or where your information comes from, people always know that.
So that's actually really important. What are the sorts of hate crimes that are reported then to you?
Do you want to come to me to that, or when you looked, Kristen, I wasn't sure if you were looking meaningfully
Well,
at
I'm happy
Isla
to
or
go
me.
for Isla. Do you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we get a lot, and I think it is important as well, because hate crime being the umbrella term that we use to describe not only criminal offences, but also the incidents that take place that people may be targeted with, where the criminal offence hasn't been committed. So we get a lot of neighbourhood disputes, certainly, and the pandemic saw that, where people were locked inside. We were having a lot of neighbourhood disputes, obviously public order, so people out and about being targeted while they're out and about. So we kind of bracket that, and certainly the city centre would be that transient type of hate crime. So people who are out and about may not necessarily know who's targeting them either. So we would get those sorts of reports. Obviously harassment, where you have that ongoing abuse that people are suffering from. Criminal damage, obviously graffiti. Neil mentioned graffiti earlier. You know, we see those sorts of things, and it's about understanding that even though it may be a bit of graffiti on a park bench, it's that wider impact. So we get people ring us because they know that there may not be an individual victim, but there may be a community victim as well.
So what is it that makes this quite a difficult conversation to have then? So it sounds like there's issues around people don't necessarily quite understand what it is, or that people see it as being a hoax, or why is this a difficult issue to talk about? Neil, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, happily. There's loads of answers. I guess it feels all the more difficult given the times that we're in right now, Tury. I think we're in the midst of what many people feel is a global hate crime epidemic. You know, hate crime doesn't occur in a vacuum. We have to look at the world around us. And if we look at the world around us, we can see that we've got political, social and economic crises taking place across the world. That leads to, well, it fuels tensions, and it leads to the scapegoating of immigrant communities. We're also living at a time where we've seen trigger events like Brexit and the pandemic normalise blame against particular groups and communities. And we're also living at a time where we've seen far-right rhetoric become part of mainstream political discourse, not just here in the UK, but across the world. So all of these factors coalesce and create a perfect storm in which hate crimes escalate. And I think it's fair to say that these are quite toxic times where the unthinkable some years ago has now become standardised.
David, what do you think? Do you want to come in on that?
It was interesting listening to the definitions of hate crime, the literal definitions of hate crime, and the College of Policing has a definition also. I would offer a different definition from the perspective of a victim. I'm very lucky I'm one of these autistic people that gives me a valuable method of concentrating on a project to see it through. It also makes me amazingly boring, but that's something I can live with. I'm lucky in another way. I'm lucky to be here. When I was a child, I had mannerisms that were different from other people, and that's what we're talking about tonight, is difference. And my language was different to other people. And I can still see the redness of the paint of the pillar box that my head was smashed against because I was different. I still smell the spit that ran down my glasses because somebody spat at me because I was different. That to me is the definition of hate crime. It's being different, it's being excluded, it's being not wanted, and it's having something that stays with you forever. And I promise you, I still wake up at nights now occasionally. One, I worry about how Watford are doing in the Premiership. But two, I still get flashbacks to the violence I received, and I remember thinking, what have I done to deserve this? And in those days, there was nowhere to go for help, because the only advice was, get on with it. Now there are places to go for help. And when you go to the police, it's not the sexiest crime in the world, it's not a volume crime, it's not something that makes the headlines very often. But the police were an enormously busy organisation with many roles and responsibilities, with shifting sands of political dialogue. I hope will be there to support victims of hate crime and understand the kind of stuff that lives in your mind forever because it's that stuff that you need somebody to talk to about and be on your side. That's my definition.
Simon, you want to come in?
I mean, I think it's difficult because, as has just been illustrated, it's deeply personal. It's, as a victim, feels it's about you, and then leads to, kind of why. And just in terms of scale, I mean, it might be helpful. So in the past sort of 12 months, we've had reported to us just under 3,000 hate crimes, in a context where we've had in that same period about 95,000 crimes reported to us in total. So, it actually is it's a significant chunk of our workload, if I can put it like that. Predominantly, those reports are about race. Race-motivated hate crime is over 2,000 of those. So the vast majority. There are others, but that's kind of what is mostly the issue that we're dealing with. But at heart, it's difficult because it's intensely personal, and as Neil alluded to, it also links into other things that are going on. So it doesn't stand alone. So almost everything that Neil mentioned is on my handy list here of when we've had a peak of hate crime reports go up. So across the period of Brexit, we were seeing hate crime reporting increase to us throughout the whole period because of the turbulence, because of maybe the nature of some of the discussions that were going on. So it's a kind of barometer of what's going on in our world. I mean, you can say the world, but we're talking about Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland, and it's a barometer of what's going on in people's lives, and it's hugely underreported. So, do I think there were just under 3,000 incidents of hate crimes in a population of 1.1 million people? No, I think the number's way more than that. But that's what's reported into us by people who are looking for help and support, which we can then access for them, or people who just want someone to know. Because not everyone wants us then to go through a criminal justice process. They just want someone to know and listen and try and support.
I think, and we'll come on to that again in a minute, because I think there is, that was something talking to people as well, was just about the normalization of it. But, David was really powerful there. What do you find is the impact of hate crime on people? You've alluded to it there, Simon. It's very, very personal, and David's just said, been telling us about his personal experience. Generally, what's the impact? What's the impact for people? Yeah. And then we'll come to Isla in a minute.
Okay, sorry, I beg your pardon.
No.
I think there are two major impacts. The one is the personal one. I was just talking about a moment ago, where it never leaves your mind. It affects your ability to trust and have confidence in yourself. It affects your ability to interact with other people, because you never know when the next episode is coming from. But on a wider scale, crimes often get picked up in the political circus because they have wider effects. And hate crime has a wider effect in society because it has economical repercussions. Because if people, for example, disabled people, are scared to go out of their front door, they stay indoors. That means they're not economically active. That means they're not receiving education, they're not attending work interviews. And obviously that has economic repercussions through society. So there are other things that we must consider. And whilst the person themselves is the victim, the most important focus of everything we do, we must realise that there are wider impacts in society because of how people are treated and how they fear the world.
Isla, you had something to say there.
I was going to use the word huge, because actually the impact on not only victims, but actually, as David said, I think our community and society as a whole. I support victims of hate as part of my role. And quite often they will come and say, actually, what happened to me has rippled all the way through our community. So not only is it one person who's feeling that they've been targeted, their entire community starts to feel targeted. So the mental impact on them becomes the mental impact and physical impact on their whole community. So that same thing around, people don't want to go out, they start feeling isolated and excluded. They don't feel like they belong. That in itself, and I actually use an image when I go into schools of that. You know, the individual's a tiny little bubble, but actually how that manifests itself across society. And I think it is important that we understand that, because I think the impact, you know, would people want to come to Leicestershire, for example, if we became known as this place that you can't be tolerated for being who you are? What impact does that have on our shops and our communities and our society? So it is huge, and I think it is wider than just the person. It is the impact, and, you know, talking to victims and talking to parents who've witnessed their children going through it, that stays with them as well. They begin to carry that burden of the child, you know, and that stays with them as well. So, yeah.
Neil, you had a point.
Yeah, so I agree wholeheartedly with what Isla and David have said. We've worked as a research centre with more than 2,000 victims of hate crime over this past 10 years, and I think those physical injuries, the emotional injuries, the community level harms are really clear to see, and they're heartbreaking. I think for me, this will sound quite glib, but trying to understand the impact of hate crime is a bit like watching a film, right? So if you want to make sense of a film, you don't just watch one scene in isolation, because it doesn't make sense, right? You need to watch the whole movie to make sense of the film. To understand the impact of a hate crime, I don't think we should just look at one incident in isolation. I think we need to understand that that incident is part of a very repetitive and damaging cycle of victimisation, a horrible cycle of systemic prejudice that's part of the everyday experience of that individual victim. And I think making that connection is really fundamental to understanding those kinds of consequences that David and Isla have just alluded to.
Amy, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I was just thinking also about not just the impact of the incident on individuals and wider communities, but then what also happens when that impact is overlooked, and then the additional harms that come because of that. So particularly when we're talking about like lower level forms of targeted victimization, like bullying and harassment that's ongoing. I mean, I think the case of the Yorkshire Cricket Club this week kind of releasing their findings and saying that this racist language that's being used is clearly just banter. I mean, these are things that we've heard for decades and we're still hearing them. So I think just that dismissal and that overlooking of victims just adds another layer of harm to what they've already experienced. And I think that's another reason why this is a difficult conversation for some, because to get recognition for the fact that that's a problem in the first place is clearly, like, we haven't got there yet. We haven't been able to be successful across the board.
And Neil, you were talking about it being an epidemic. There's huge amounts, and you Simon and Isla, you're on the kind of the front line of this, dealing with it. Are there issues with resources? Have you got everything you need to deal with those? Or is that are you looking at me like you're nuts?
No. Isla's going to go first at that.
Okay.
Resources-wise, I don't think you can ever have enough resources to be able to tackle something as big as hate crime. But we definitely do have a robust programme, making sure our officers and staff know the expectations of the chief and down of what we would expect our officers and staff to do when they're interacting with victims of hate. Would the chief like more staff to be able to deal with it? I'm sure he definitely would do. But yeah, I think it is one of those things. Being underreported obviously gives us the ability to help and support those. But the more people that we can encourage to report, the more important it is for us to make sure that our officers and staff are properly equipped to be able to go and challenge and deal with it. So, but physical resources, I shall leave the chief.
I mean, yeah, we've gone through a period where we have lost 20% of our people, and we're a very people-focused business, and people do what we do. And, you know, we've got tech and gizmos and DNA. You might know a bit about that. You know, but we rely on people. We're now growing back to sort of replace, in effect, what was gone. So, you know, that gives us more capacity and capability. I think the other thing for us is the better we get at engendering trust to get reporting, the more of it there is reported. And you then get in a world where there's a sort of performance expectation to reduce, this is something that I'm saying we should see this go up, because we need to get better at dealing with it, we need to increase reporting, but that's kind of at odds with some of the performance frameworks that we sit within, because actually to me success is more people report, because then we've got a better idea of what we're going at. Then we can start looking at perpetrators. Are there repeat perpetrators? How do you then deal with those perpetrators? What's an effective way of doing that? So, and it's, as I said, out of the best part of 100,000 crimes, it's about 3,000 of those crimes. So, it is a chunk of our workload. And the other challenge for us at the moment is, because we've got lots of new people, we are bringing in lots and lots of people and having to train them up to deal with, and that is a good challenge to have. I'd rather have that problem than getting smaller. But we've got quite an inexperienced workforce who need to understand and be in tune with local communities and what some of the significance of these kind of incidents are. But the big performance challenge is actually having more is success, and understanding it, but then it gets you into wider issues about, do you finish stigmatising the place that we all care about, which actually, in general terms, is quite a welcoming place and has a reputation as being a welcoming city. And so it's a really complicated, and this is why it's difficult, because some of the things within it are contradictory, and at the heart of it, it's about making the world a better place.
So,
Could I just add a point to Simon's comment there? I think that's important. I think it's important we realise police officers are members of society, drawn from society, yes, with additional powers, authority and training, but they're members of society, and it's the society where the problem lays. It's the non-understanding, it's the fear, it's the distrust where the problem lies. It only generally goes to the police. Once it's gone so far, people are seeking some kind of help. But society is where the problem lies, and society is where the police are drawn from. So we have the social problem needs to be addressed as well as laying it at the door of your local constabulary.
Well, and I'll say this, and I said this at an event some months ago and spent quite a long time afterwards talking with somebody, those kind of conversations that go on at the back of the room. One of the pieces of work actually which Irene's MP did with Rob Morby from here and Nottingham was a piece of work around police officers' experiences of hate crime. And I wouldn't want it to be the sort of headline thing that we're talking about here, but the more diverse we've got, the more experience officers have of hate crime, which is in general terms racist abuse of officers while they're doing their job or making arrests. And so that's kind of an implication of that. And that piece of work was done by here in Nottingham, 3 or 4 years ago. It was a kind of qualitative study of the experiences to try and help me to understand how we could support colleagues who, as well as dealing with whatever they were dealing with, were then suffering a hate aggravated offence.
So I'm going to ask all of you actually for a big issue that's on your mind these days, and we've been touching on a lot of it, I think, already. But I'll start with you, Neil. What's a big thing that you've been kind of really thinking about with your research these days? Just one.
Okay, so Simon referred to underreporting a little while ago, and I guess for me that continues to be a major area of concern because incredibly significant numbers of hate crime victims aren't accessing any form of justice. So our research has shown that 3 out of 4 hate crime victims don't report any incidents whatsoever to the police or to other agencies who could potentially provide support. But we also know from research that the increase in recorded hate crime doesn't mean that more people are reporting than before. It means the same people are simply experiencing more hate crime than before and reporting more hate crime than before. So the volume, the increased volume is real. I guess lastly, a recent piece of research that we helped Liberty with has really troubled me. It's shown that 1 in 3 hate crime victims in 2020 withdrew from criminal proceedings. So all of this is deeply worrying, and it comes at a time when the criminal justice system is perhaps at more strain than ever before. And we've seen cases like Sarah Everard and other high-profile tragedies, injustices, which have affected levels of confidence in the police and the criminal justice system. But we've also seen such delays and such cuts across the board within the criminal justice system that there are accusations that the system's broken, and I can see where those accusations are coming from. So from a hate crime victim's perspective, this is deeply troubling and worrying, and I think we really need to be more radical in our thinking about justice generally and access to justice if we're going to develop any meaningful change in this space.
Isla, what's one of the things that's troubling you at the moment?
Having just heard what Neil was saying, I was going to say actually, and the biggest thing that does trouble me is the normalising of abuse that victims will be subjected to. It fits into underreporting, and I know, talking to victims, there are lots of reasons why people won't come forward and report. But I think there is also the danger that we've all got used to it becoming a social norm, that we have normalised it. So we're starting to be more accepting of the inappropriate behaviours of others towards us. And that is my biggest concern, is that we know we want people to come forward, but actually people are accepting of it more so, and they're not coming forward and reporting. So it links into underreporting, but some of the reasons for underreporting trouble me in that it's because we're starting to say, well, actually, we can't do anything about it, so we're just going to accept it. Or we've had it for so long that we'll just take it as, we've lived with it for so long, we'll just accept it.
David?
I think one of the difficulties with the reporting is that sometimes it might be necessary to report the people who are the very closest people to you in life. So they might be caregivers, family members, friends. They may also be your abusers. So it is extremely difficult. Who really wants to go to ring the police or appear at the police station and report your brother, mother, best friend, carer, especially when carers are so difficult to find in this day and age. Carers are very thin on the ground and will get thinner because of forthcoming regulations around COVID jabs. So why would you want to jeopardise yourself by removing the only friend you have? Why would you want to jeopardise yourself by removing the person who gives you intimate care? Why would you want to break up your family by making a report of a crime? I would suggest it was unlikely that you do. But some people have done it, and it has widespread repercussions. And I don't know what we do about that, because at some point you have to formalise your complaint. And that brings about familial problems.
Simon?
I'm going to cheat and go for 2 things. One is, and we've touched on it as we've gone down the line there, what's an outcome in all of this? Is an outcome an appearance at Leicester Magistrates Court a week on Tuesday? Or is it a restorative justice outcome? Or is it actually that the issue or the problem is confronted and solved going ahead, which may be part of some of those other options or may have nothing to do with it? And I think the other thing is what's going on online. Which is enormous and difficult.
And, very hard to do anything about. Amy?
Lots of things that trouble me. One thing that's like an ongoing issue from my perspective, I think, is when we reflect on what we actually know about hate crime, the information, the first-hand accounts that we have, that actually comes from quite a small amount of people. It's quite a narrow remit. And typically academics, practitioners and policymakers, we've all really over-relied on certain communities and certain groups volunteering that information or saying yes when we ask them to work with us. And usually those are the communities that are more established and they have more confidence to do that and they feel like they're going to be believed and supported. And because of that, it means that there's a lot that we don't know. And it means that there's a lot of hidden victims as well, people that their voices are just left unheard. And so those communities are usually the most marginalised and the most stigmatised. And historically, we haven't made enough effort to reach out to them and build meaningful relationships with them. So they've just stayed hidden, and they get labelled as hard to reach as opposed to just kind of easy to ignore, really. So that's why in my research I specifically chose to focus on the experiences of new migrants, refugees and asylum seekers. And you kind of heard a little bit about my work at the beginning there. Other colleagues in the school are also doing this and recognising that we have these hidden voices. So we've got people working with homeless people and rough sleepers, with sex workers, and with Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities as well. And these are all groups that are victims of a system that constantly overlook them as victims. And in some cases are actually applying criminal sanctions to their lifestyles. So it means they're even less likely to come forward if they are a victim of something like hate crime. So that's something that troubles me, is the fact that we rely very much on certain communities and we're not making the effort, as all of us, as academics, practitioners and policymakers, to build those more meaningful and trusting relationships, because they are out there, they're just not being accessed as much.
So very final question from me before we go over to the audience for their questions. What's the way forward? Who else needs to be involved? And this is, I realize this is a very big question for a last question, but I don't know if you want to go along very quickly and go, what if you could wave your wand in terms of ways forward to work with this, what would you do? Who would you involve? How would it work? Yeah, you can kick things off.
Okay. So I'm going to say something that sounds really pessimistic at first, but there is optimism there. I think the past 18 months or so have reinforced the fact that we've reached a point of crisis. But for me, a crisis is a window of opportunity. It's a test. It tests our capacity to change. And I think we really need change in the context of hate crime. So I hope events like this, difficult conversations, can be a springboard for wider dialogue, not just between academics and criminal justice practitioners, but also professionals within other sectors: housing, health, public transport, education. We've seen that, we often think that hate crime is a criminal justice issue or a policing issue. It's not. It's a societal problem. It's a public health problem that demands, not requires, it demands collective investment and ownership. And we've seen a public health approach work really well in the context of other forms of violent crime, because it requires us to prioritise prevention, evidence gathering, long-term commitment, addressing underlying inequalities. That kind of approach really, I think, is the key to hate crime.
Milo, what would you like to see?
Again, I think it feeds on from what Neil was saying. It's about being able to get our communities and society as a whole to have trust and confidence to come forward and join us in trying to tackle what is a huge societal issue. But we can only do that if we have everybody who's prepared to talk, sit down and come up with solutions, because none of us sitting here can do it on our own. We need the input of our communities and society to help us fight that fight.
David.
Looking back historically, and I can probably look back further in history than most others here, things have changed and things are moving in the right direction. When people like me were victims, hate crime didn't exist as a concept. It started to exist in the 90s and the noughties. Then the police got on board and started to realise that there was a separate category of crime and interest, and things are moving in the right direction. I guess if we were discussing any topic here tonight that constitutes a crime, any crime whatsoever, you could always say that things are not moving quickly enough in the right direction, and I guess that's true. But this is a world of finite resources. This is a world of misunderstanding, of lost opportunities. So we're moving forward, but if I had one hope and prayer, it would be that we move forward slightly more quickly. But then I guess anybody with an interest in any sector of crime would say exactly the same.
Simon.
Well, I suppose just building on that, when I started as a police officer, hate crime didn't exist. So the fact that it exists and we're sat talking about it, and that I think it is largely accepted as a real thing, is important. I think you can't arrest your way out of a crisis. We can lock people up. But then whether the outcomes are ones that suit victims and take things forward, I think you could have a pretty vibrant debate about, actually. And, at the risk of sort of education is always the answer, isn't it? There's that sort of quote, Desmond Tutu saying, "Don't keep pulling people out of the river. Find out why they're falling in the first place," kind of quote. There is a danger. It all sounds very aspirational and nebulous, isn't there? But the bottom line is, society needs to work together better to get rid of some of the rubbing points. But within that, as a police officer, we do have a role, which is a formal role, which we take very seriously, which isn't the same as saying we always get it right every time, but we do take it very seriously.
Amy?
I completely echo the points that Neil was making about how we really, this is the point at which we really do need to sit down and radically rethink the way that we ask ourselves, what is hate crime and what does reporting look like and what does justice look like? It really does need a kind of reconstruction of all of that. I think as academics, moving forward, we also need to get into the habit more of speaking outside of our bubbles, outside of our silos, speaking to audiences that aren't naturally going to agree with us and being confronted with some really harsh realities. So I think that's absolutely something that we should be doing, and at least I think tonight's event showcases some of that. But it needs to happen on a much broader scale as part of a normal practice of what we do as academics and practitioners, I think. So, yeah.
Could I just add one point? I'm going to heavily misquote the 2014 Leicester hate crime project, and I'll probably get told off for it afterwards because I'll get it wrong. But one of the researchers interviewed a set of people, a set of young people from an Asian origin. And they said, why is it you distrust and dislike other kids? And they said, well, the others get all the fast cars, they got all the money, they got all the best jobs, they're just... And then that researcher went to some kids of a white origin, and they said, why is it you distrust them? Well, they get all the fast cars, they got all the money, they get all the best jobs. So it's that fear of the unknown. It's the not knowing, and it's that kind of not understanding that is a breeding area for hate.
It's your turn. You have these amazing people who you can ask questions of. So do any of you have any questions? There's one at the back there.
Yes, I was involved with Neil in that one with the hate crime study. And what I've got a question for you, Simon. How much training does the actual police actually have in that one at the moment, and what the training routine of what they've found that the police have? And I know it's also to do with the public sector as well.
Yeah, and I might come to Isla because she probably does some of the delivery. If you were to join today, we do work with the St Philip's Centre actually in the city to try and expose recruits to backgrounds and communities that they maybe haven't come across before, because we recruit from all over the place. So there is a part of that which is about being community aware and competent, sort of culturally competent, or as competent as you can be. And hate crime forms part of your training. If you've been in for a while, if you've been in a long time, hate crime has happened whilst you've been in. So hate crime has been this new legislation, and you'll have had inputs around that. Kind of cultural competence, if I can call it that, training, exposure to the specifics of the legislation. And then the other thing as well is that we try and make sure that what we do is scrutinised. So there is a sort of lay panel of real people who look at our hate crime sort of dip sample and look at what we've done and how we've gone about dealing with the things that have been reported to us. But you do some of the delivery, don't you? So
yes. So every new starter in the organisation has the delights of having me go in and talk to them. So our new police officers will get me for 2.5 hours. And I don't talk legislation. I'm not a police officer, so I leave the legislation to the uniformed officers. But I go in and talk to them about victim impact, the consequences, the wider societal impact, and if you like, the expectation of what we would want them to do when they're dealing with victims. But I talk to call handlers, so giving them an understanding around what kinds of calls they might get, the things that we would like them to ask, and making sure that they appropriately put that information in. Our front desk inquiry officers, they get an input from me as well. Our specials, our PCSOs, everybody comes in and they get it more from the side of a victim. So I'm not talking to them about legislation. So we do spend a lot of time making sure they understand the impact of hate. And then we've just done, I think it's 16, 17 months worth of me doing refresher training. So all our frontline officers and staff have had refresher training from me around correctly reporting and recording of hate crimes to ensure we don't get it wrong on the system and that those victims are recorded and heard. So yeah, we do quite a lot.
Hi. You've all spoken about incidences of hate crime, and for every hate crime, there is a victim and there is a perpetrator. You've spoken eloquently about the way that you support and want to engage with victims. But what I'd like to know is there anything that you are doing or that you have done, any projects that you're involved in, that actually engage with perpetrators in order to perhaps change their attitudes, change their behaviour? And if you have done anything, how successful was it? Is it?
Talk about what you're doing at the conceptual. I talk more generally about the research space, and then you can chip in if you want. I'll start off. So I think it's fair to say that the majority of research within the hate crime world is victim focused, and I think that's been the case for some years now. That gap, that lacuna, when it comes to addressing hate crime perpetration. In part, that's for practical reasons. It's pretty hard to get access to hate crime perpetrators, primarily because many aren't convicted, many don't go through the system, and many don't really want to talk about hate crime perpetration. So there are pragmatic reasons and access issues. What we do know from the body of research is that whilst all of us might think it's quite tempting to think of hate crime perpetrators as completely different, as having extreme beliefs which set them apart from us. We're the good guys, like they're the bad guys. And that's true in some contexts, but in the vast majority of cases, hate crime perpetrators tend to be quite ordinary people committing hostile acts in the context of fairly routine, ordinary lives. And once we start to make that recognition, I think, in one sense, that's really worrying, because it's like, oh my goodness, we've normalised hate to that extent that it could be any of us. But actually, for me, it's quite comforting to know that hate crime perpetrators are relatively ordinary people, because it means that when we try and develop interventions, well, we can do something about it. We can educate, we can think more imaginatively about how to support perpetrators. And I use that term deliberately. I don't think it's just about supporting victims. I think we can support perpetrators. I think we can, to coin a famous politician, we can understand a little bit more and punish a little less. And certainly the body of research evidence suggests that there isn't that demand for punishment amongst hate crime victims. They just want it to stop. And once we start to recognise that the demand isn't necessarily there and we don't need a punitive outcome all of the time, we can start to develop much more imaginative pathways of support, not just for victims, but for perpetrators as well. And I think you were alluding to education, programmes of intervention within prisons, within communities. There hasn't been the robust evaluation of those programmes that I think there needs to be. But certainly what evidence is out there points in favour of more restorative dialogue, so where victims and offenders can come together in safe mediated environments. There's support for that in the right context, not across the board. It's not a panacea, but it can work. And there are other initiatives as well. But certainly I think the general thrust is that we need to be a bit more imaginative with the way in which we deal with hate crime perpetration.
One of the biggest difficulties with hate crime is establishing motivation. It's a difficulty that the police face every time, I imagine, that a hate crime is reported. So an assault is an assault. There will be evidence. There will be physical evidence or eyewitness evidence or whatever. There is evidence of an assault. But what motivated that assault is what illustrates whether it's a hate crime or not. If somebody did it because somebody didn't include Branston pickle in their sandwiches this morning, that is not a hate offence. But establishing motivation of hate is important. And if you don't establish that motivation, you can't categorise the perpetrator, and therefore you can't talk to a group of perpetrators because you didn't establish the motivation in the first place. So there's kind of that process problem as well.
Can I just add?
Of course.
Only in answer to yours, it's not a formal process that we have within the organisation, but on the back of the request of a lot of our victims around educating people who've targeted them, I now work with frontline officers and staff and go actually and speak to people who may have been, not crime, but I'm going to say the incidents where we're there asking for some sort of out-of-court disposal, so community resolutions or community orders. And I actually spend time with perpetrators going through actually what motivated them to do what they did. And yes, it's small numbers and it's not necessarily something that we can academically look at and get outcomes of, but every single one of them has actually said to me at the end of that, I never actually realised that what I was doing could be seen to be a hate crime. I spoke to somebody who was involved in the online incidents involving the England footballers during the summer, and he was mortified when I spoke to him, and actually to the point he asked me to send him through some of the information I spoke to him about so he could share it with his own family and friends. So it's very small, but it is something that I'm committed to doing because I think it is important. And if we can get victims to agree and perpetrators to agree that that's something that they would like to do, I'm hopeful that those small numbers will grow and we can stop it. So it is something that we're doing already internally, and obviously, the superintendent that I report into is aware of what we're doing and trying to see if we can get more traction to that.
I mean, just quickly, just ballpark of the incidents reported to us, just under a fifth of them result in a formal outcome, which could be court, could be a conditional caution. So it could be, you are required to do something which is a restitution in effect. And about a third of them, and Neil mentioned this figure earlier on the national data, about a third of victims don't want us to progress down a formal route, and then their needs are different, but broadly they maybe want some support, they maybe want the person to know, but they don't want it to go down a formal route so that we finish in the magistrate's court or whatever. Intriguingly, about 3/4 of we do lots of victim surveying. About 3/4 of victims of hate crime are satisfied with the service that they get from us, which is interesting when we detect about a fifth of them in sort of old money kind of police speak. What is wanted is not always to see someone. It's a recognition of harm. It's a somebody being having to look into their own conscience. People want to know that the personal impact on them is understood, which is different from being fined 200 quid at the magistrate's court, whatever.
One over there.
She's there. The microphone has to go the furthest.
Thank you. Hello. So we had some questions come through on social media, and we asked kind of students this morning their perceptions of hate crime and any questions that they had for the audience. And kind of leading on to kind of the answer you've just given, there was quite a few students asking about moral education and when should that start, and a lot of people kind of asking, is that something you should teach and should it be taught in schools, or is that something that shouldn't have to be taught and that should be within us? So the question is when should or when does moral education start, and is there something that we could be doing proactively rather than reactively to help tackle hate crime?
Does anyone feel particularly?
Well, you go into schools, don't you? We do now. Whether that's moral education, which sounds a phrase that has meaning, I don't know. But You know, we do a lot of work which is around communities, schools, colleges, partnerships, trying to raise awareness and help, you know, prevent really, whether that's a moral education. I'm not sure, but its intention would be about prevention. It would be about making people realise the potential impacts, you know, and it sits in, is it still sort of PHSE sort of education within schools? And certainly we're part of that, and schools would be, you know, very involved in that and keen, I think, to have us there.
I mean, from we go in, we've created something in partnership with the council around diversity. So from Key Stage 2, our PCSOs and our partners will go in and deliver diversity training to Key Stage 2 children. I've developed packages that particularly target, if I say, from year 6 all the way through to higher education. And I was just saying before this began that the demand for me going into schools now is becoming greater from a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach, which has taken me 2.5 years to get there. But I'm delighted that schools are now actually saying, can you come in and talk to our young people around hate crime and the impact it has? Because I think it is important. Yes, obviously, I'm still asked to go into schools and talk to groups of students who have been found guilty of certain behaviours. But the reactive element is becoming less and the proactive side of it's becoming greater, which I think is really, really positive, especially around educating our young people.
Peer-to-peer training work quite well in that context either. So within schools, like, are they quite receptive to other young people talking to them about those issues, or would they prefer somebody from the police coming in? How does it work?
They tend to ask me to go in only because that peer-to-peer stuff doesn't necessarily work, because you do get the, oh, they're just being ultra-sensitive, or why is it so wrong for me to use that? But I have in a few occasions actually asked young people to give their experiences of what it's like to be on the receiving end of something inappropriate and why that impacts. So a bit like what David was saying in his personal experiences, because I think lived experiences are the best way that we can get people to learn and understand. I can stand there, I have my own lived experiences, of course I do, but they're not the same when I'm going in to talk to young people about homophobic language or racist language, if I can use young people. So I do a little bit of both, and I think it's developed. It depends. Some schools are more receptive to it, others aren't. But equally, schools are sometimes more receptive to me going in because I'm not in a uniform than there maybe would be with a uniformed officer standing in front and talking to their students. It just depends on how the schools want to do it, and if you like, whether they want a hard-hitting message, or is it just, we want you to be aware more culturally or more morally. And I think that's where a lot of it is coming in, is they want their students to start looking more inward about how they're behaving outwardly.
Could I add a point which is a clear example of what you just said, Isla? I'm not sure if it's in the park of morals. I'm not sure I can give much information on that particular topic. It's an area of development for me. But with disability hate, there have been fantastic programs in Sweden and Norway where people are taught the impact of hating disabled people, or the impact on the victim, and it's changed behaviours. And that's the output, that's the measurable output, is that behaviours have changed and life is improving. So education, please.
Yeah, there was a question.
No, I was just curious, because just to cheer you up, I teach my sins.
Thank you for your service.
Yeah.
No, I'm here because I'm curious. And are you the police commissioner? You're one of the first who's ever sent me an email asking me about my environment, my home environment. And I'm really here to say thank you so much, because I've got a chance to be here and talk about the problems. But remember, just to cheer you up, 85% is parental influence at home. And I often think, I've done PHSE, it should be called citizenship, and it should be the law, because you don't understand the law until you broke it. And many children come from homes where they're not, mum and dad aren't solicitors, they're not teachers, they're not primarily middle class children, they're kids. And it's like rules. They have rules in school that becomes the law. And I often think, people, please, and I've been there
Yeah.
Many parents will park their kids in the bedroom with the screen while they quietly get on with life downstairs. You know, and they don't even fix their homework, basically. So,
And it's interesting what you're saying, because one of the things I actually scribbled down here was in other bits of our work, we would talk about adverse childhood experiences, and we would talk particularly around domestic abuse, around the impact of that on. Yeah. Yeah.
but kids are normalising that in their backgrounds, and possibly they're parked upstairs looking at the screen while mum and dad are fighting downstairs, or, you know, I've certainly, and I'm not going into details, safeguarding reasons. So there's some really distressing stuff that happens for kids who are 11 years old. You know, being pinned down basically upstairs on the screen while mum and dad are sitting downstairs. And it's just really bad. 85%. 85% is down to home influence. So don't blame yourself necessarily. At least there is the complex evidence. People are prepared to work with complex evidence. But I guess that's why it's so important with the work I'm doing with schools and schools opening up, because actually I was in a school today where it is explaining to the young people the consequences of their behaviours if they don't challenge. And I agree with you. You know, what we see and what we hear is social media, online. The Chief mentioned that, you know, the dangers of what our young people are exposed to online is something, but equally we police that in the same way as we would do if they were doing that face to face. And I think a lot of them don't understand that. They don't understand the consequences behind what they're doing. And it is around going in, and actually a lot of the schools invite me in during PSHE or whatever those sessions are to say to the young people, and I agree, it is about what's influencing them outside. It's not only their parents, it's their peer pressure as well. So it's the circles that they, you know, but I think it is important, and it is something that, you know, it is important to address.
Thank you very much for that. I know we've got a question just here, haven't we?
I have a slightly different question as such, and this is probably going to split opinions, which is fine. It's great, in fact. We've heard all of you at different points talk about political influence, societal influence, and the influence of media that has such a huge impact on hate crimes. But part of me, and while I don't condone this behaviour, I believe it does need addressing. Part of me sits here thinking, not we specifically, but as a whole, we're winding up a monkey and then slapping ourselves on our head when it moves, when that's exactly what we sort of programmed it to do in the first place. And I can only use this in terms of like drug structure. Your low-level runners always get caught really, really quickly because they're the ones that you can catch and they're the easiest for you to do. But when this is going on such a systemic sort of macro level, is that where we're better focused rather on these isolated individuals, because it is a whole triangle of needs and problems as such. So that's my question that I have for you. Thank you.
Do any of you feel best placed to answer that one? Do you want to try, Amy?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a big question, an important one though. I absolutely think that hate crime as a whole has sometimes been criticised for focusing very much on those individual interactions that happen. And actually, if we don't acknowledge the structural inequality and the hostile environment that we've created, then does it matter if we stop one person from committing hate crime? In the much larger sense, probably not. And so I think, yeah, it's a really, really important question that we have to address. And the question as to how is a really good question as well, because we've seen what happens when top-level politicians say horrendous things in front of mass media, and then perpetrators will go out and use that language directly themselves to legitimise what they're doing on the streets. So I wholeheartedly think that we need to tackle that. from my own research. So I looked at not just the experiences of new migrants, refugees and asylum seekers, but also all the different levels of kind of structural harm that they were experiencing because of lack of opportunity to the labour markets, to housing, and to like not even being able to get the legal status they needed to stay in the country, and the challenges that brought. And also the pressure on them to do this thing called integrate, and what that means, and the fact that how can we expect people to integrate into their new country if we're not tackling these really, really huge issues that they're facing on a daily basis? They're not going to go out into the world if they think they're going to be the victim of a hate crime or general discrimination and hostility. So again, I'm not sure if I'm being very helpful because I don't know the answer to how we tackle that specifically, but I think it's a really, really important question that we always ask. So thanks.
So we are getting tight for time. You will be able to continue the conversation outside. We've got drinks and nibbles and things like that for when you want to go out. But a huge, huge thank you, and I'm going to hand you over to Gary.
Thanks, Tury. So yes, I just wanted to thank the panel for their time, for your expertise, and in particular for the thought-provoking ideas that you've given us tonight. I think it's been excellent. Tury, thank you also for your excellent facilitation. We mentioned at the start that this is a series. If you go and look at our website and look at the centenary section, you'll see the future upcoming talks that we have. I can tell you now that on the 6th of January we have the next talk, which is entitled "Are Cities the Biggest Threat to Our Survival?" Going to look at how regeneration and recycling are fundamental to how natural ecosystems are sustained. And we will have the City Mayor, Sir Peter Soulsby, speaking at that. The recording for this will be online later tonight, so if anybody has missed it or got friends that want to pick up on it, please go and look at it. But thank you very much. Thank you for coming, and have a safe journey home.
Thank you.